Is it clear? Okay, fine. So if people can have their seats and starting. First, I want to say I'm so thrilled to be here. Dr. Rubens Kinyal has created a meeting that many of us will remember for a long time, and remember with learning, remember in a conscious and physiological unconscious that will be a part of a long learning history. So very nice. And then especially to hear Dr. Tronik present some marvelous material visually, so we know what we're talking about in regulation, attunement, and dysregulation. I'm going to just quickly make a point about consciousness. Remember, the consciousness using a Gestalt model is what we're knowing right now, and there are other things out of our awareness we can call unconscious. It might come into awareness, and we might call beyond unconscious, non-conscious physiological models. This just says, when we'll talk about consciousness, we'll look at sequences of consciousness. And most of us say this is a primarily cortical process of the brain, the top part of the brain. While if we look at the subcortex, you'll notice there we have a series of nuclei. It's like a huge mechanism that's working for us for millions of years, getting better and better. And my wish is to say, what's the relation between what we know? Everything seems to be there. As Dr. Edelman said, it's all unitary, the consciousness. Therefore, we don't suspect that comes up from what's called the cortical, subcortical, non-conscious, so many influences. I'll draw a picture to give you simple. It's all simplified. Look how those conscious sequences that I'm aware of, my words, your thinking, your little movements you're aware of, are riding on top of a constant input. Well, let's breathe, because as body therapists, we're really in that great existential moment. In fact, if you say existence is the most total, essence is a part of existence. Essence meaning, as Sartre said, existence is before essence, the totality of our consciousness and our non-conscious and all our levels of being is a much more total situation than this riding on top of the waves conscious awareness. In fact, we much watch out for our language. If somebody says experience, it's not clear if he's saying the conscious experience. So let's use these ideas to create more precise language. I'll say consciousness, periphery of consciousness, dynamic unconscious, dynamic, a working memory. All this can come into consciousness. Freudian dynamics come into consciousness. So there we're talking about the cortical processes. But today I want to go into the subcortical processes. Once again, to give you a picture. Consciousness is like the foam that rides on top of the cortical wave. You see that foam on top? And look at those arrows and circles called semi-autonomous systems in interaction. at the subcortical level, and even in the somatic body too, which I won't have time to treat. So all of those semi-autonomous systems in interaction are throwing up messages and making us ride our consciousness, like the foam on the wave. Of course, there's a down effect too of the consciousness toward the subcorticals, but we're going to emphasize the upward movement from the subcortical knowledge toward the consciousness. Now, I want to stay with this design a little bit and suggest in this design of diverse subcortical dynamics, the neurophysiological unconscious, and it cannot come conscious. It can influence, it can give us intuitions, but in itself, it's in the non-conscious level of knowledge. So we have different things happening, the hippocampus and the amygdala and the basal ganglia, BG, and the TH thalamus, and below we have the hypothalamus, and below the central gray matter, and below the nuclei of the base we have 4 at least. Look at those arrows pointing up. Those are pushing up neuromodulators that are activating the brain in different ways. And then we have the visceral organs influenced by the lowest nuclei, the solitary nucleus and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. Well, we have quite a network that's getting us along. Now, the things I'll say are just speculations, correlations. In a couple of years, we'll say different things because we're in the forefront of science, of a new science. And I think the point of this is stimulate the curiosity and the awe when we can see what's happening inside. Now, I want to, let me just see, I think ahead, no, I'm going to go back. We saw a beautiful image of Dr. Tronick yesterday using Alan Shore's ideas that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, different levels of the autonomic nervous system, are playing at multiple levels in the brain, playing at the highest frontal lobes, especially orbitofrontal, and playing in the singular gyrus, and playing in the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the tegmentum, and lower levels. This chain of sympathetic, parasympathetic, action-prone, receptivity-prone, action use up the energy, receptivity renew the energy. All that is happening at so many multiple levels. And when we say, therefore, there's a little bit of experiential discomfort, we might call episodic part of the non-conscious knowledge. The episodic is what's happening. Shore and others emphasize these aspects of the autonomic nervous system, a kind of experiential level. Very important, I propose, is to include now the basal ganglia, because that's where the main subcortical regulation of action routines is occurring. And if we can bring that into mind, as Edelman reminds us, and understand that basal ganglia is getting information from so many levels of the cortex and the amygdala, etc., and then influencing the thalamus as a subcortical station, gateway, and then these messages are shooting up, so that before we thought the thalamus was mainly taking in the proprioception of the body and the environment and the perception, but Edelman says yes, but it's also taking in our motor sequences And these motor sequences influencing the thalamus then are influencing cortical sequences, perhaps even thought sequences. Now, we're getting more and more complete idea of the brain. Edelman also says we may have a tendency to focus on one point or another as a dynamic. The amygdala is much correlated to emotions, and the hippocampus with spatial aspects with some intentional influences, etc. But he also reminds us of distributed processes. Distributed processes means in any moment, the whole brain is working. The whole brain is involved, although we may see functional elements in certain parts more than others, but it's all together. Just want to mention about what I saw in the film that I really appreciated. We saw an interaction with the mother, and the baby is playing in a reciprocal way. Our colleague Daniel Stern talks about attunement, meaning intensity correspondence, rhythmic correspondence, and even shape correspondence of movements. And based on this attunement, people are feeling good together, acting well together. And then Dr. Tronik has found this very marvelous way to interrupt it in a subtle way, hopefully not really damaging to anybody, it's very momentary, of the still face. Now, the still face, how is that creating so much disturbance? Well, Ledoux says not only is it being registered in the conscious cortical part of visualization, but even our subcortical amygdala is registering this still face. At the same time, I've been thinking, but why is the baby so unhappy and disturbed? So I want to add another point, which is very connected to ideas of body psychotherapy. Yes, we're dealing with emotions, inner perceptions, true, but we're always in a certain awareness of the action system. Let's imagine the person who's depressed for a while. Those amygdala feelings are working up very strong. They're sending up influences of the thoughts toward the cortical levels, they should be influences downward toward the hypothalamus and lower autonomic nervous system, and visceral effects, and even hormonal effects and immunological systems are being affected by the amygdala. But the amygdala is also laterally almost sending to the basal ganglia the message, move, let's move. The hypothalamus is contributing, also the frontal lobe and the other singular gyrus. They're all indicating move. So when there is no movement for your situation, that's very, very suffering creating. And I've been interested, how is that suffering so great? It's an output system, the basal ganglia. Why should it have a retroactive effect, not only toward the upper consciousness of the cortex, but even, it seems, of the subcortical levels? Well, we don't know yet, but there's an interesting aspect. Look at the NACC, that's the nucleus accumbens. It's an intermediary station between the amygdala and the basal ganglia, also receiving inputs higher up from the singular gyrus, etc. Well, let's imagine that nucleus amygdala in some way gives us a feeling, I'm powerful. What is the evidence that the nucleus amygdala gives us the I'm powerful experience, which is then going all over with re-entry and everything. It's distributed. But the person who takes cocaine has this drug go right into the nucleus accumbens, replaces the normal dopamine, and the person feels so powerful for a few hours. It's great, they say. Look at them. But when you understand what I'm saying, you'll never go near that, because for weeks and months longer, he cannot get his dopamine functioning normally again in the nucleus accumbens. He's in withdrawal, unhappy, suffering. He'll have to go to communities and other things. So look at the contradiction. He's got that very momentary cocaine, nucleus accumbens, great, connected to the power, because it's shooting to the basal ganglia. The strength and the basal ganglia is giving routines. But his situation is in complete disequilibrium after, for a long time. So it's better to look at the brain, look at its natural components, and say, let's do everything possible in other ways to make us feel good, competent, strong. Now, when I saw that baby in his unhappy state receiving from the mother the still face, that still face was not only a stimulus that creates difficult sensation. There's another level called the cingulate gyrus, which is picking up expectations and mismatching of expectations. And that baby cingulate gyrus, among other levels, is picking up the surprise that mother's face is not a smile. I propose at the same time, the baby has lost his action program, because the basal ganglia, to work correctly, needs an input that is coherent. So the mother then, after a few moments, she sees it, she gives new stimulus input. Interesting, not only did she give her face, she gave some touching. Because there's another thing we see. When the baby had the loss of that sudden positive presence, a little bit like Bowlby says, with the loss of the positive inner object, there's a moment of search. Let me give you a hypothesis of how that can be working. Imagine those inner images, cortical and subcortical, are feeding into the thalamus, the gateway, different stimulus levels. Imagine the absence suddenly of the input creates in the thalamus a disequilibrium, because the thalamus may function with what is called optimal stimulus levels. So when the baby no longer gets the mother as a part of the optimal stimulus level, the absence, the baby can begin a series of agitated movements. They say it's the search for the mother. Yes, that's true. But I propose it's also helping the thalamus return to an equilibrium, because the thalamus is needing some new stimulus. Since it cannot come from the outside, the body is auto-producing the new stimulus with muscle tensions and movements. In fact, there was one scene, I remember the baby turned away. Okay, maybe there was something on the visual that could be stimulating the unhappy perception with the mother, the visual, but also that turning was creating a counter stimulation into the muscle system and then its return up through the ascending reticular system to get back to the thalamus and help the thalamus maintain a little bit of equilibrium. Just think. Okay, so we have fascinating things to think about as we're working with our people and our patients. Very briefly, I won't say more, these nuclei are receiving stimuli from the emotional amygdala and the basal ganglia action system, and that's also keeping up our brain activity with a series of the neuromodulators, I'll say fast. The dopamine, the serotonin, the noradrenaline, and the acetylcholine, which are activating and helping memory and helping thinking. That justifies our active learning methods. As we did with the facilitators, we got in and we begin to do the game. It was no long explanation. And I propose your action system was learning very quickly and has a good memory of what you're learning, so that tonight, this afternoon, when you go back to your group, you feel, you just use the action system with confidence, and you're going to have good connections in your groups of 10. So that's action-oriented learning, called active learning. And it'll be remembered much longer than any series of ideas, just like driving the car is much better remembered for years and not reading the handbook. But I want to have time to go to the clinical situation. Isolation, loneliness. There is the cortical level. I know I'm isolated. I know I'm a home. In fact, the typical life today is maybe a little bit like the still face of Dr. Tronick. I come home from work. I've had activity. And what do I see in the house? 4 walls. That's like a still face. So I'm agitated. What do I do? If I have not developed a basal ganglia routine of music, creativity, design, exercise, diary writing, something, if I have not developed it, well, actually, we do have a solution. We dissolve the brain, in a sense, with the television. I wonder if they ever tried with those babies to shoot in lots of images, and maybe the baby will lose its momentary agitation and also will lose its sense of I and the other in life. Let's think about television. In any case, the isolation and the loneliness are connected to experiences of obsessions. That means it's the same thought that repeats itself. No sequencing, same thought. Helplessness means the connection to the basal ganglia is pretty stopped. And negative mood, lots of reasons, but means the whole thing is in disequilibrium. Now, what's the brain doing then? I propose a simple idea general is to say, in that isolation, prolonged, we get reduced circuits. Edelman's technology, Gerald Edelman's, would be a reduction of re-entry, spiraling, interacting cycles, vertical and horizontal, and a reduction of the distributed processes of the whole brain. So we have whole brain reduction of functioning in prolonged isolation. And the person is quite unhappy, depressed, and says, "Doctor, I don't know what to do. I feel hopeless." picture. This next drawing was made by Leonardo da Vinci. I searched it. You'll find that only in special textbooks. Sorry. Eventually it'll be fixed. So look at the positive self-other dynamic. Look at the two arms stretched out in an inviting way. When we understand that the basal ganglia needs a little bit of encouragement to go forward, this little openness is encouragement. Too much invasive, but just encouragement. Then one of the ways we have in the psychotherapy developed by some schools to really help the person let it out is that these movements will follow the laws of Daniel Stern and Dr. Tronik, the laws of attunement. These movements, as listening, will be rhythmically like this, and therefore in time with a person's verbal output. Yes. They will be in certain correspondence to the body. Yes. And the intensity will be appropriate. Soft, parasympathetic for the cry, and very strong, intense to sustain the anger levels. So these called, Dr. Stupides here, who developed the word body empathy, these body empathic movements become an essential part of the healing, one of our tools, beyond all the other tools of asking, how are you, and following the deeper experience. One point, when I'm talking about the action, you're thinking about, okay, muscular action like this. Verbal action, talking, is also action, because all the verbal output is connected to a series of action expressions. Yesterday there was a very interesting incident. There was a very strange speaker who was so identified with his verbal action output that when he had the visual stimulus of his material blocked, it was like a still face experiment. This strange speaker got into a little bit of a rage. Inappropriate, of course, but just to show how much this action system wants to go forward and can be blocked even by a simple visual block, or even somebody's talking like this and you go like this. No, even that is blocking his forward direction, like running on a track. His thoughts cannot run like running on the track if he's getting input on a visual, auditory level, which does not correspond to his motor movements. I say it because in the inner dynamic of this poor patient, we're all that a little bit, there's the memory of so many self-other interchanges in which the other blocked him. No, you're too much, absurd, please. Or, don't you think you should grow up? Or, you're going to fail. All of these blocking perceptions from a negative interaction are remembered. In fact, one of the points is remembered, not just the thought of the consciousness, but remembered at all these amygdala, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, central gray, nuclear of the base. It's remembered at all of these levels. Therefore, the body therapist, all therapists, of course, using their body, but body therapist with the person. The person is like this, and the body therapist is just there, empowering.